Have you checked the children? You're a little mad sometimes.
Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
Sometimes that is better.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Long days and pleasant nights, fellow travelers along the path of the beam. I am known on this level of the tower as Jaime and Fuego, and if you please join me here for a bit of palaver on Hail to Stephen King, or I guess in this case, hail to Richard Bachman. I mean, anybody in the know is aware that, yes, King was Richard Bachman and, yeah, put out his fair share of things under said alias. But today, we are here, and obviously, nobody knows, welcome to the horror show, to talk about the Go Arnie One-Man Army adaptation of The Running Man, which was originally a Richard Bachman, smaller, almost novelette, kind of bordering along the, the size of an actual novel proper. But yeah, The Running Man, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, that just recently saw its 35th anniversary, and I know they were mentioning that there's like a 4K release that either was just released or is about to hit or something, so that was recently announced, and yeah, this is one, in my estimation, that is a little needlessly hated, and it's needlessly hated because of the fact that it's really very little, it says even in the Wikipedia, very loosely based on the Stephen King writing as Richard Bachman's story. And that's because, as I did in a reread just earlier this year for the 40th anniversary, of the actual source material, that was released, the book, in May of 1982. And so earlier this year, I did, as the book of the month here on Hail to Stephen King for the Horror Show, a reread, and then even a week or so ago, when I was about to go on a vacation, I was like, do I want to dip back in and get even more additional context? And that's where I wrestle in these sort of situations, because I've been trying to find the good in so many of these drastically different Sai King adaptations, and The Running Man being a prime example of this. If I'm going to compare it to the source material, it's nothing like it. And the tone, while it starts out a little akin to it, it really diverts drastically, especially when it turns into big, glitzy, glamoury game show of goofiness in a lot of ways. But there are some of the precepts involved, most notably the fascination with just violence on television, the addiction to that, and there are some, just to get some coffee real quick, there are some, dare I say, predictive, prophetic, borderline aspects to this, as far as something taking place in 2019. If I remember correctly, the novel was maybe 2025. I can't recall specifics at this particular point, but yeah, as far as the widening gap between, the very privileged rich and the despondent poor, that's something that this film exudes significantly, and also just the growing fascination with seeing this sort of carnage on screen, and, especially in front of a live studio audience. But yeah, so The Running Man, accurate adaptation, not really, but enjoyable if you want to look at it as something that is just another turn of the wheel, a different level of the tower, so very similar to, like, okay, we're showing up in Topeka in Book 4 of The Dark Tower, Wizard in Glass, and yet, yeah, we've got Nozzle Cola, and we have vastly different, like, makes of cars and, sports teams and so on and so forth. This version of The Running Man, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, is most definitely that sort of different interpretation, but one that, if you're into the action vehicles of Schwarzenegger, especially at this particular time, I contend it's one of the better ones. It's a lot better than Red Heat and Raw Deal, It's of a comparable level of enjoyment to Commando, which there are actually some peeps that have ties with this movie to that one, which was put out, I think, 2 years before, in '85, if I recall correctly. So this is when Schwarzenegger was still establishing himself as, like, said, action star, so to speak. So we didn't really have Seagal going at like full pace just yet. Bruce Willis hadn't done Die Hard just yet, and this film actually shares a screenwriter with Die Hard, the Stephen E. De Souza, so the guy who actually adapted The Running Man for screen. He also went on to write. I mean, I guess that would be one of the first, proper credentials that I will toss out. The fact that Stephen E. De Souza, he had written 48 Hours previous to this, and Schwarzenegger's Commando. He would go on to do Die Hard. He would go on to do the sequel, Die Hard 2. He also did Beverly Hills Cop 3. He did Hudson Hawk, Judge Dredd. So lots of action stuff that did implement aspects of humor into the writing, and when you see all of the one-liners that Schwarzenegger has in this, like, he had a couple one-liners, you know, like, stick around and stuff like that. Obviously, I'll be back from the original Terminator that is straight up referenced in this. There's one particular point where he's about to compete on this death game show called The Running Man, and he says, I'll be back, to Richard Dawson, and he's like, only in a rerun, so that's cool. So there's lots of one-liners throughout this, and so that's what De Souza brought to most of his action fare, was that slight bit of silliness, that little aspect of tongue-in-cheek. And then the director, Paul Michael Glaser, who he was originally Starsky on the Starsky and Hutch television show, and he had lots of other acting gigs and stuff like that, but in the 80s he was getting into directing, and so he had done some episodes of Miami Vice, and then he would go on in the 90s to do The Air Up There, if anybody remembers that Kevin Bacon movie. He did Kazam, widely considered to be one of the worst films of all time, but yeah, so a actor's director, if that makes sense, because of the fact that he started out in front of the camera and then shifting behind. But Schwarzenegger actually had some criticism about his approach, saying that he filmed it like a television show as opposed to a feature, and I'm like, well, the predominance of the movie is about a television show, and so for that reason, it's just like, okay, Arnie, I understand some of your criticisms, and I mean, this was the same year that he had Predator coming out, and up until this point, he had done, like, obviously the Pumping Iron documentary is something a little bit different in the 70s, but like under his belt up to this point was The Terminator, James Cameron, very much a director's director in said regard. He'd done both of the Conan movies, even if The Destroyer wasn't anywhere near as good, and he had done Commando. And so, yeah, I can understand maybe some of his criticisms, but he was still fairly fresh in the just being in front of a camera as opposed to just a bodybuilder, weightlifter, you know, sort of like competitor in said regard. And so this is one project that definitely calls out for things to be television-y, if that's even a word, which it's likely not, at particular times. And so that criticism may be not necessarily warranted. However, the original intention for this, they went through a few different directors, and there was a budgetary constraint that made one director depart. There was another one who he was a little behind schedule in the shoot. He was only a week, and yet they fired him too, and that's when they brought on Glazer. But really, the fact that De Souza did 15 different drafts of this script throughout the course of the movie. He was even doing rewrites as they were shooting it. So that shows that they were struggling with tone, and the film does, in fact, struggle a little bit with tone in the fact that it's trying to just to maintain and just just kind of keep down pat some of the original themes of the King book, which is about class struggle, about that sort of narcissist, exhibitionist, bloodthirstiness, you know, as far as television goes. And yet, especially once the games begin and this Running Man competition, it turns into, as Richard Dawson's character says at one particular point near the end of the movie, he's like, they love sports and wrestling and game shows and violence. And yeah, most definitely in the 1980s, and it still continues to this day, that fascination, that obsession is still incredibly inherent in not just Western culture. I mean, over in Europe and in South America, I mean, it doesn't really matter. I feel like as far as areas of this world where that sort of entertainment is readily available, whether on the internet or on television, it's pretty popular, even still, you know, 35 years after this film initially came out. It's still there, so not much has changed. It's only become that much more saturated, that much more accepted, I guess, in a lot of ways. And so the original person who was going to play Ben Richards was none other than Kristopher Reeve. Yeah, that's right. Our Superman, at least up until that point when this film had come out, was supposed to play Ben Richards. And I feel like he would have epitomized the aspects of the character from the original book, the Bachman book, so much better than the, you know, roidy silliness with all the one-liners that we ended up getting. And that's because, while I said that I wasn't going to try to, like, make some major comparisons, I'm going to at least a little bit right here. It's not going to spoil anything. But I will say, the source material is very little to do with the gladiator aspect, and it's more so to do with, like, him being a running man, him on the run, as opposed to in this, like, big game showy freak show sort of set where all of these different killers are being sent after him. Like, the source material is very much more so about Ben Richards going around a large chunk of the eastern United States, and he's escaping a YMCA, crawling through like these like sewer tunnels with rats and stuff. And then he does in fact take a woman hostage in the back half of that book, and it's that role that's reappropriated here with the singer, model, and actress, where is her name? Maria Conchita Alonso. And she reminds me a lot of Salma Hayek, at least in the snarkiness of her delivery. She's pretty and she's feisty, and so she's got that going for her. And but the fact that they turn it into this almost like love dynamic with her initially being a hostage, and then she gets pulled into it when she starts to realize that these television networks that are government controlled are in fact misshaping and misrepresenting things. And so just for kind of aiding and abetting him to the most minimalist degree, she ends up getting thrown into the game show craziness. But really, as far as taking the woman hostage, and as far as the competition aspect of the Running Man, and the character played by Richard Dawson, which is very amusing to me. The character of Richard Dawson, so I had no idea he was on Hogan's Heroes and was this British comedic actor before he got into the game show hosting with Family Feud, which is kind of fun. But yeah, he was the host of Feud for the first iteration and then came back in the 90s for its third iteration. But just getting him in this R-rated sort of situation is really amusing, because of the fact that he gets to drop some F-bombs and be very crass, and as opposed to squeaky clean like you had seen him as the, you know, just, he would rib people on the Family Feud, if I remember from seeing reruns when I was a kid, but, you know, it was still very PG, bordering on G-rated. It was not just this level of vulgarity and embracing this very seedy sort of TV host who also has the inner workings with the network and stuff. And so he is great in it. Arnie is amusing. A few supporting players that I have to make mention of. Well, actually, no, there's really only one other noteworthy one that I have to toss out, and that's Yaphet Kotto. And so a lot of people know him from the Homicide: Life on the Street, because he was on that for a number of years in the 90s. But for me, I mean, he'll always be from the original Alien movie as one of the main characters on the ship there with Ripley and so on. So he's great in this as somebody who, in the revising of the storytelling, so just to give a little bit of context there, Arnie is this guy who is part of law enforcement. At the beginning of the film, we see him in this helicopter, and there's a bunch of people rioting over food shortages and stuff like that, and he is told by his superiors to gun down all of these peeps, these like 60 plus rioters. He refuses to do it. When he refuses to do it, he is in turn, they end up all getting shot, but he is detained, the shootings go down, and then as he is thrown into actual like full-on like prison work custody and stuff, it's all kind of shifted around and makes it seem like he did it willingly, and they turn him into, they bill him this like bloodthirsty butcher of, it's something else with a B. That's one thing that I did not write in my notes properly. But so he's in this, like, I guess, internment camp of sorts, which is very Mad Max in its appearance. And so with Yaphet's character and then this other, like, tech whiz guy who you always know he's a tech whiz in the 80s if he's wearing glasses, as Lady Catherine pointed out and made me laugh. But so they are trying to escape and link up with this resistance group, which is essentially trying to overthrow this government slash network sort of association. And Arnie does escape with these two guys, with Yaphet and with the tech whiz guy, and they all go their separate ways. But after Arnie kidnaps said woman, and then is taken back into custody and forced to compete on the Running Man, his two fellow escapees are thrown in there too. And so this is where the film goes from a not deep analysis of the haves and have-nots, but I mean, it starts to lose at least a few of its more profound themes when it does veer into straight-up spectacle of silliness. And yet, it's still fun, man! I mean, especially with the fact that these guys, these runners who are trying to come and kill him, are so goofy, larger than life. You have one named Sub-Zero, who is, like, got this, like, Far Eastern Asian hockey angle sort of thing going on, and that's one of the cheesier bits. But then, the ice rink goofiness, and then you also have Buzzsaw, who was the previous season's winner as far as being able to take out the runners, or the most runners, or whatever, and so he's a chainsaw guy. And then you also have Dynamo, who has this silly, like, illuminating mohawk thing going on, but yet he's also like an opera singer, so this is where it gets so goof-tastic in having a distinctive identity and personality, albeit one-dimensional, for all of these runners that are going after Arnie and his couple of compadres and trying to kill them. And then later on, you have Maria, Conchita's character, who is taken and thrown in her own little suit as well. And so she becomes a runner along with Arnold and these two buddies of his who have links to the Resistance. And yeah, this is where, as I just mentioned, for the umpteenth time, this is where it just gets so over the top. And it's gory, but not that gory, I mean, the one-liners are fun because you've got some barbed wire that is wrapped around Sub-Zero's throat, and there's an inquiry where he's like, he was a real pain in the neck. Arnie has a different one-liner for the dispatching of all of these different guys. For Buzzsaw, he's like, he had to split. So it's amusing, it really genuinely is, and Arnie delivers them with enough tongue-in-cheek sort of silliness, which is quite good. How about a light? What a hothead! Where you've got Fireball, so you've got the ice guy, you've got the chainsaw guy, you've got the electric guy, which is Dynamo, and then you have the fire guy. So they all embody it, and then you do eventually get, if we're going to talk about wrestling connections, you have the straight-up wrestling connection of Jesse the Body Ventura, pre his Minnesota governor days. He is one of the retired dudes on this. And so early in the film, you have this Captain Freedom, which was his moniker that he was going under back when he was one of the runners and killing these competitors in this gladiator sort of fashion. But he's got, he's retired, he has his own workout video, which is pretty amusing, and so that plays a part, and he has to, at the back half of the competition, as Arnold is just dispatching all of these different bloodthirsty runner executioner sort of guys, Ventura's character has to come out of retirement and just don the crazy, almost robotic, fake, cyber arm sort of silliness, and he's not even into it. You can tell that he is past the point of the silly spectacle, and he's like, there's a time where I would crush these, the pipsqueaks like Arnold with my bare hands, and I wouldn't need all of this gallantry and, these dumb uniforms and everything. So he's very much, he has the conviction of the competition aspect with regards to this. And so that's one thing that I will, like Jesse Ventura in the few scenes that we have him in, he is in Predator this same year with Arnold. So they were building that rapport, I guess, as far as being on film together. But yeah, Ventura is not bad, and so that's the thing. This movie is not poorly acted. Even between Maria's character, Arnie, the supporting cast that I mentioned, Richard Dawson. Another thing, Easter egg that I have to mention, which is very funny about this. So okay, Richard Dawson, game show host, obviously, he is in Mallrats, and there is a character by the name of Sven who is the main security guard that is a go-between in this. So Sven was apparently a 1980s Danish bodybuilding champion. That same guy, Sven, his last name eludes me, but Sven is actually, I was trying to see if I wrote it down, but I didn't. Sven is also, along with Richard Dawson, in Kevin Smith's Mallrats. And so the Sven guy plays a character by the name of LaForce, who is the main security detail person where they're trying to set up the game show in Mallrats. And so that's a very funny little connection that I had no idea about, but I'm just looking at this younger version of Sven, and I'm like, you haven't heard of LaForce's? That looks just like LaForce's, if I'm going to quote Jay. And so yeah, that's a funny little connection, but as I'm kind of rounding out all of my thoughts about this one, as disjointed as they may have been, I dig this movie. I genuinely do. I feel like despite the just absolute insanity that we have on screen, most notably once the bloodthirsty game show commences, it does still have some central themes about corruption, about addiction, most notably to on-screen violence, and how we were really becoming this, I guess, very Roman sort of let them compete and kill each other. Funny factoid, actually, as I found out looking at the Wikipedia, is that apparently when American Gladiators was being pitched by the producer / creator of the show to network execs and trying to actually get this thing up and running, he showed clips from The Running Man and was basically like, yeah, this is the show except without the murdering. And if you remember American Gladiators from the late 80s, early 90s, with just the big roided up silliness and the fact that just regular everyday people were competing against these gladiators, aka runners, if you're going to make that comparison, you totally see where the DNA spawned off of this particular adaptation. And there was also a 1989 computer game that came out. And then even when, if anybody remembers the arcade game Smash TV, it took this same, film before live studio audience, like kill competition sort of thing. And this film also was under some critical fire from those who tried to sue it after, sue the producers and the makers of this film after it came out. And so in 1958, there was a short story that I would imagine Stephen King derived inspiration from. It was called The Prize of Peril. And so that was a short story. And then that short story was adapted into a German TV film called Das Millionspiel, and that was in 1970. And then in 1983, there was a French feature film called Le Prix du Danger, which translates to The Price of Danger. And so the fact that the producers of The Running Man were sued when it had already very obviously been adapted into, things beforehand with the German TV film and then with the French feature film, but perhaps they had navigated those sort of waters. And I think because of the fact that it had Stephen King's name associated with it, and at this particular point in the 80s, Sai King was so firmly established in the public lexicon and just the mainstream, so to speak, that yeah, I could see the people behind a not too profitable French film or a 70s German film or the estate of the writer responsible for the 1958 short story. But the whole game show competition, death sort of scenario, it's been done a lot at this particular point between Battle Royale, between the Hunger Games. So it's not, granted those came significantly after, obviously, but this was one of the forefathers, at least as far as mainstream American cinema. The film had a $27 million budget, which for 1986 when they were filming it and then 87 when it was finally released, that's a pretty hefty budge, man. And so it did make $38 million at the worldwide box office, so it turned a profit, but between mixed reviews from critics, just modest positive reception from audiences, it was profitable, but it wasn't like a big smash success. But I will echo the sentiments that I feel like in the late 80s, this is one of the better Arnold movies. Aside from Predator and Terminator, this is on par. It's not as goofy, which is a word I keep jumping towards, as Commando. Commando was a lot of fun with Arnie and Alyssa Milano, but it's way better than a lot of the other stuff that he was doing in the mid to late 80s before veering into comedy with stuff like Twins and Kindergarten Cop and just trying to get a little bit of a more diverse sort of approach to his acting and showing that he's not just a one-liner guy, that he can carry things in a comedic sort of sense. So I enjoy this movie. Is it perfect? No. Is it very faithful to the adaptation? Most definitely not. And that's where I'm very curious, if it transpires, because last year in 2021, Edgar Wright of, awesome things. Between Baby Driver, between Scott Pilgrim, between Shaun of the Dead, very, very talented guy. And I enjoy his approach, to filmmaking and his aesthetic that he brings to everything. But he is signed on and currently developing with, what is dude's name? I just want to make sure that I don't totally butcher it. Michael Bacall. And so Michael Bacall was originally a in-front-of-screen guy who shifted into screenwriting later on. He did write the script for Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, which Wright directed. And then he also did more goofy stuff like, 21 and 22 Jump Street. And so for that reason, Edgar Wright has been proclaiming since getting this project together that it's one of his all-time favorite Stephen King books and that he wants to do a more faithful adaptation. The Bachman source material is not wrought with a lot of humor at all, aside from maybe the very end where a character is flying something into a building and flipping off TV executives and whatnot. So there is a dark humorous aspect to it, but if you're going to go for more faithful, I do think more faithful to said source material of The Running Man by Bachman is going to be more serious. And so to bring on a writer who has done primarily comedic stuff, that's where I I don't know, man. I don't know. Red team go. But that is at least presumably still in development, though we haven't got an update in, I think it's been nearly 2 years, because I think it was February of 21 that this was initially announced, and we have heard donuts for information since then. And as I've said countless times on this program, we hear about Sai King adaptations, and then often they're just fallen by the wayside. They say, there's an announcement about rights acquisition. There is an announcement that things are in pre-production, that they're in a developmental phase, and then nothing ever becomes of it. So based on his talent as a director and the fact that he does want to do a alleged more faithful adaptation, hey man, I'm all for it. I've watched every Edgar Wright movie and, at least to a degree, loved all of them, of varying levels of enjoyment, obviously, but I don't think he's made a bad movie, so to speak, and so for that reason, bring it on, very much about it. That from a filmmaking standpoint, though, I love the fact that you can tell that it does have a budget. I mean, the bits where they're in these steel cage balls being thrown through all of these tunnels down to the competition stage, I think those bits are really well done. You can tell they spent money on this. You really can, between the set design, between the fact that you had Paula Abdul doing this choreography for all of these pre-show dancers and stuff. Very well done. And also, I like the music in this movie. Lady Catherine was making fun of me about it, but Harold Faltermeyer, who did scores for Beverly Hills Cop, the do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Yeah, I also did Top Gun. I believe he won a few Grammys for both of those, and then he composes the score for this, and it's key synth-centric, as you would imagine, with the body of work that that particular, I think he's German if I'm not mistaken, but please don't hold me to that, but this European composer, yeah, he does a very serviceable job, and it's catchy, and it is a little more on the moody side. Yes, it does veer into the goofy and silly, which are the two words that I keep narrowing down, but I feel like it's very in line with the vibe of this film. And then the end credits has this John Parr song, and when I heard it start playing at the very end of the film, I turned to Catherine and I'm just like, oh man, Restless Heart, I forgot about this song. And yeah, John Parr he was a British guy who did the themes for St. Elmo's Fire, and I think he did 3 Men and a Baby. He did a bunch of different things in the 80s and the 90s as far as the theme songs for films, and Restless Hearts is awesome. Running Away with You, or Running Away, I think it's Running Away with You. Good song, man. If you guys have never heard it, it's a ton of fun. It is one of those very deep-throated, oh boy, just, I don't know, Michael Bolton-y, kind of very power voice-centric sort of approaches to it. It feels so much like a theme song from a film or a television show, and it's a lot of fun. It's very well done. And so, for that reason, at the very end of the day, between the one-liners, between solid performances throughout, between the fact that there is a budget, and even if it really does not maintain the tone that the source material did in a lot of ways, and it goes for a much more happy-go-lucky ending in comparison, I still really enjoy The Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger from 1987. This particular DVD that I have, I don't have it on Blu or 4K or anything, but it has a ton of really solid special features. It's newly remastered. It's got a bunch of stuff really delving into the subtext and the overt sort of commentary. They have one about game theory, an inside look at reality TV programming and its cultural impact on society. You've got Lockdown on Main Street, a documentary about the current state of privacy and criminal issues in a post-9/11 society. You've got audio commentaries with producers, directors, Rob Cohen, who is an EP on this. He's part of this too. So yeah, I mean, there is a bevy of supplemental materials if you get this particular version on DVD. I believe they did migrate those over for some of the higher definition releases, but I dig this movie. I can understand some of the derision about it, but I am a fan, and so for its 35th anniversary that just recently transpired, everybody, that is my thoughts on none other than Arnold Schwarzenegger's adaptation of the Richard Bachman by way of Stephen King book, The Running Man. So, I extend a grande gracias. I've been Jaime and Fuego. You can find more on all social media sectors like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, here on YouTube. The book of the month for here in December on Hail to Stephen King by way of the horror show is none other than Different Seasons back there. So, the very first Tuesday in January, I believe it's January 3rd, if I recall correctly, that is when we are going to be doing the next live show that is going to be discussing the 4 novellas in there, which is The Breathing Method. Yeah, I love The Breathing Method, but it also has 3 of the more well-known, and including 2 of probably the most well-known adaptations of Cy King in The Body, which was turned into Stand By Me, and then Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, which was made into Frank Darabont's Shawshank Redemption. And then you also have, to a slightly lesser degree, but in my estimation, a fantastic feature film as well, in Apt Pupil, which was made by the rightfully denounced Bryan Singer, but that doesn't take anything away from the great performances by Ian McKellen and by Brad Renfro I have reviewed the film on here previously, but I have not done that particular story. So yes, it's going to be a live discussion about all 4 of those novellas that are housed in different seasons. And obviously, the liking, the sharing, the subscribing means a hell of a lot on here. And yeah, the only other thing that I have to give a shout out to is all of those who tuned into my discussion about the fact that Mike Flanagan is doing a Dark Tower, or at least attempting to do a Dark Tower television series. It may end up on his new home at Amazon, or it may end up somewhere else, although according to my buddy Maddie, Netflix has already passed on it, and that's not just because of the fact that Flanagan is migrating from Netflix, where he did like Haunting of Hill House and Midnight Mass and a number of other things and saw significant success, migrating over to Amazon. They're just not that into the idea of a Dark Tower television series at Netflix, and so it is carved out of his deal with Amazon, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't end up there. If you want the full discussion that I had when that awesome, exciting news of Flanagan trying to get it off the ground and turn it into a 5-season series along with a couple different feature films, I have that linked in the end credits. And yeah, guys, that is here as we near the end of 2022. This is one of the last episodes that I will be putting out. So yeah, lots of other fun stuff coming here for the horror show. Aside from Sai King coverage, most notably, we're going to be doing our best of 2022. It looks like with Marsha's departure and with Cecil being very busy with Dylan's new nightmare, it is in all likelihood just going to be a best of. So we're not going to be doing most anticipated, to the best of my knowledge. And I know we have decided not to focus upon the negativity of our 6 worst. So we're not going to be doing a worst of this year. It's just going to be best of for sure. And we're also going to be catching you up on some news and on some of the other things that we have been just watching as far as like a review roundup aside from the best of the year. So as we wind down 2022, that is what you have to look forward to. And thanks as always to Cecil, the founder of The Feast here, and to Sai King, who if not for him, we wouldn't have these 300 plus episodes of Hail to Stephen King to just have the awesome opportunity for me to cover. So I've been Fuego, y'all have been Rad Status, and until the Wheel of Ka comes around once more, hasta luego, and amigos, constant readers and viewers alike, say thank you. I hope we have been well met. We share more of this palaver sooner rather than later, and until then, remember to stay scared and read Stephen King. I mean, obviously in this case, also watch Stephen King. Give this one another shot. I really enjoy Schwarzenegger's The Running Man. And in some ways, it's kind of tough for me to determine as drastically different as the short, novella is compared to this, which one I like better. They're very different beasts, but in a lot of ways, for me at least, equally enjoyable.